Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Kathleen, and today, Jorby, for inviting me today. It's lovely to connect with you all virtually. So over the course of the next hour, I'd like to focus on one of the most important but maybe less visible aspects of drug development, and that's drug safety. When most people think about drug development, they naturally think about whether a medication works. But long before efficacy determines our commercial success, safety determines whether a program is actually allowed to continue. So, next slide, please. Drug safety can seem like a huge topic, and rather than trying to cover everything here today, I'd like to answer some practical questions that people commonly ask. What do we actually mean by drug safety? Because I think it's often misunderstood in clinical trials. How does it work inside a clinical trial? Where do sponsors most often get into trouble? And finally, what practical steps help prevent those problems? So that's our roadmap for today. So next slide, please. So let's begin with the first question. What do we actually mean by drug safety? It's a term we all use, but if asked, everyone in this webinar would define it. To define it, we'd probably get several different answers. What you'll see on screen is the World Health Organization has a formal definition, and that maps out four very specific operational pillars: the detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse events. Now, detecting means identifying adverse events from all available sources. Assessing means evaluating the causality and severity of that adverse event. Understanding is about characterizing the true risk benefit profile across our target populations. And prevention is about minimizing risk through updates to our study documents like our protocol, our investigator brochure down the road, updates to our product label, and other proactive risk mitigation strategies. So that's the formal definition. In practice, it means recognizing clinical patterns early enough so that we prevent any harm to our patients. So, if the WHO definition tells us what drug safety aims to achieve, the next question is who actually does it? And I think this is where things can become more complex because drug safety isn't one function, it's made up of three distinct functions. Next slide, please. People often use the term medical monitor, pharmacovigilance, and risk management interchangeably. They aren't the same things. They are three distinct disciplines that have to run at the same time simultaneously. So to keep them straight, I like to use a simple rule of thumb. The medical monitor is protecting today's individual patient. Pharmacovigilance protects today's study, and risk management, they're protecting tomorrow's patients. With our medical monitor, they're the ones that are at our clinical site making the clinical decisions for our patients. Our pharmacovigilance teams are maybe slightly behind the scenes. They're detecting and assessing the adverse events. And the risk management team is using that individual and aggregate data from our medical monitor and our pharmacovigilance teams to look at the benefit risk analysis and determine if risk mitigation strategies are required. Next slide, please. So I want you to imagine a scenario that all of you are working towards. You spend years developing a molecule. You're gone through all of your seed funding, investor funding. You've gotten your regulatory approval, and you've started to dose your first patient. It's the moment that every biotech company works towards. Then 3 months later, a letter arrives from a regulator. Clinical hold. Not because your drug failed, not because it lacked efficacy, but because the safety processes failed. And unfortunately, this isn't a hypothetical example. Regulators place studies on clinical hold every year because of safety concerns or deficiencies in the safety oversight. In reality, safety, sorry, um, we often think that drugs are sorry, we often think that clinical trials are paused or stopped because of efficacy concerns. But in reality, safety concerns account for a substantial proportion of trial discontinuations. And deficiencies in safety reporting remain one of the most common findings in our GCP inspections. And many people assume that this is a late phase problem. In fact, the greatest vulnerability for any trial exists in early development. If we think about a first in human study, it's probably one of the most exciting moments in the drug development process. After years of our basic laboratory research and our moving into our animal research, we're finally studying our medication for the first time in humans. But with that brings several unknowns. We don't know whether unexpected toxicities will emerge. We don't know whether the predicted starting dose will behave as we expect it to. We don't yet know how people will metabolize our drug. So it's also a point of greatest uncertainty in the drug development program. At the same time, many early stage sponsors and small biotech companies, they have lean clinical teams with limited in-house drug safety expertise and often no previous expertise acting as a clinical trial sponsor. And so understandably for them, it's an overwhelming time as well. So managing safety in this environment is challenging. Not is challenging because no single individual or department has complete visibility of emerging safety profiles. Information is generated across study sites, labs, data systems, medical reviews. And the challenge is not simply collecting that information, it's connecting the dots early enough that we can recognize any potential risks for our patients. And next slide. And I think that's fundamentally why drug safety is very much a collaborative effort. Effective safety oversight depends on multiple functions working together to monitor, evaluate, and communicate emerging safety information. The next slide. When people hear the term drug safety, I think they often think of some team in the background that collects and reports adverse events. And while those activities are important, drug safety function plays a much broader role in protecting patient safety throughout clinical development. Drug safety serves as a central hub for safety surveillance, and it's bringing together information from multiple functions to build a complete safety profile. We're involved in reviewing, evaluating data, identifying potential risks, assessing risks, and recommending actions. However, we can't do this in isolation. Effective safety surveillance depends on close collaboration across the clinical development organization. As you can see here on this slide, the ClinOps provides insights from study sites, data management is involved in ensuring our safety data is captured accurately. Our medical monitoring contributes their clinical expertise. Biostats helps us identify trends and matter and patterns. And our reg affairs, they're involved in communicating all of our safety concerns to our health authorities. And while each function contributes a critical piece of the puzzle, it's the drug safety team that integrates all of those inputs to evaluate the risks and support important decision making. And this collaborative approach creates multiple layers of oversight and helps ensure that any emerging safety concerns are recognized and assessed and addressed as quickly as possible. So if our drug safety team is coordinating and leading safety activities, what does this team actually do on a day-to-day basis? So let's take a closer look on the next slide. So rather than just processing and reporting adverse events, the safety team operates a continuous life cycle, one that begins months before our first patient is even screened and extends long after the final database is locked. So let's walk through the cycle. It starts months before the trial is active. This is where we're building our safety into our study design. We're co-authoring key documents like the protocol, developing the safety management plan, which serves as our operational blueprint for how safety will operate over the course of the trial. Once recruitment goes live, we enter into, I guess, an operational phase. This is where we're looking at individual adverse events. We're capturing, we're coding, we're reviewing, we're evaluating. In the third phase, we have our analytics and reporting. We we stop looking at cases in isolation and we start looking at aggregate patterns. We're asking, are we seeing a trend? Is a new safety signal emerging? Finally, then we have governance and oversight, which wraps around our entire process. And finally, then we have clinical engagement. And I think COVID probably changed the landscape here a lot, because more and more what we're seeing is that drug safety team has important roles to play, not just in site and investigator training, but also in educating and engaging with our patients. And what you should notice is that each stage feeds into the next. If we have weak planning and setup, it guarantees that we're going to have poor data collection and operations. Per case operations completely compromises our ability to do signal detection. And weak governance will mean that at some point we have a risk of missing an emerging safety trend. So drug safety can only ever be as strong as its weakest link. Next slide. And while the drug safety life cycle can seem straightforward on paper, in practice, it's often where organizations of any size, from early stage biotechs up to global pharmaceutical companies, run into trouble. Next slide. And on the screen here, you'll see that there are several common pitfalls that weaken the safety life cycle at different stages. Now, I'm not going to go through them all today, but I would like to focus on a couple that I believe are really important for early stage biotechs, and also tend to have the biggest impact. So the first challenge is what I like to call the the delegation trap. Many sponsors, particularly during early stage trials, they outsource safety activities to CROs. And that's fine. And the responsibility for safety then they assume is transferred to the the CRO. But that's not how our regulators see it. Activities can 100% be outsourced. The accountability for those actions cannot. Ultimately, the sponsor remains responsible for patient safety and regulatory compliance throughout our study. The second challenge then that we often see is the database silo. ClinOps relies on the clinical database. Safety, drug safety relies on the safety database. Both teams will assume that their database is the source of truth. But what happens when they don't match? Imagine a clinical database records a patient with grade 2 elevated ALT, while the safety database records the same event as grade 3. Which version do we report to our regulator? And we see this all of the time where discrepancies like this aren't identified until just before a database lock when teams perform reconciliation activities. Suddenly, then the timelines for the study are under pressure as teams start to scramble to resolve inconsistencies, identify missing cases, or determine which record is actually correct. What could have been managed throughout the course of the trial through periodic reconciliation becomes a last minute critical activity that very often puts our study timelines in jeopardy. And the third challenge is the infrastructure overkill. And this is something we often see with early stage companies. In an effort to prepare for more the future of the trial, they invest in these highly complex safety systems and processes that are not only costly to implement and maintain, but they far exceed the needs of a current phase 1 program. And we're going to come back to this point in a minute. Well, what's interesting when you step back and look at these pitfalls is that they're not an issue with the science. They all have the same underlying issue, and they're failures of governance, communication, and planning. And I actually think that's really encouraging because it means that with clear governance, well-defined responsibilities, integrated processes, and proactive planning, many of these risks can be prevented long before they have any effect on our patient safety, our study timelines, or our regulatory submissions. And next slide, please. Right. So, if someone asked me how to build an effective safety function from scratch, I'd focus on just three principles: governance, integration, and proportionality. Everything else can build around these concepts. So, the first is the proactive governance. So, we don't wait until an annual safety report tells us something has gone wrong. Governance means that we're continuously reviewing and monitoring our safety data and safety processes so that we can identify risks as early as possible and put in place risk mitigation strategies that ultimately protect our patient. The second is our integration. So safety information has to move seamlessly from our investigator to our drug safety teams to our health authorities. And the only way to do that is with clearly defined, documented processes, well-defined communication and escalation pathways, and clear roles and responsibilities. The third, which I believe is the most important for early stage sponsors, is our proportionality. And we mentioned this a moment ago, where the goal isn't to build complex commercial grade pharmaceutical or drug safety systems before you've even completed phase 1. It's about building an infrastructure that matches your current risk profile. Yeah. And that will grow as you move through to phase 2, phase 3, and on to regulatory approval. And it is of these three pillars when discussing with early stage sponsors, it's always proportionality that brings about the most questions. And I think the fundamental question is always the same, and that's how much drug safety infrastructure do we actually need? Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So the answer to this is that it really depends on your trial. You have to have an infrastructure that's proportionate to your product's risk, number one, and the current complexity of your trial. In early stages, it's about building lean agility where we have core documents in place, well-defined processes for safety reporting. As we move into our phase 2 and our phase 3 trials, we transition into an expanded framework where we're intaking cases into our safety database. We're updating our aggregate reports and our investigator brochures. We have in place then our governance committees. And finally, at our registration and commercial stages, we're transitioning into a fully integrated, globally validated system. So at each stage, we're building a system that's robust enough for today's study, but can still grow and develop as we move into our additional stages to our program. Next slide. Thank you. So rather than we've covered a lot of topics and many can seem a bit abstract. So let's start to look at them in terms of real world examples. The next slide, please. So the first scenario I'm going to talk to you about is one that demonstrates why signal detection or aggregate safety review isn't something that starts in a phase 3 trial. It's something that has to start from our very first patient. So in the case of this program, we had a phase 1 oncology trial. And during that phase 1, several participants developed small elevations in ALT and AST liver enzymes. Each of those increases was very mild. None of them were concerning for the investigators at the site. None met any sort of criteria for stopping the drug. So overall, none were particularly concerning. As the program progressed into phase 2 and then on into phase 3, what they began to see was more patients were showing the same lab abnormalities, at more severe grades, and eventually a cluster of clinically significant hepatotoxicity was identified. The next slide. Thank you. Now, this was a major regulatory finding when the where the sorry, where the trial was halted. A clinical hold was placed on it because there was non-compliance with key regulations. There was deficiencies in several key study documents, including the DSUR, the reference safety information from the investigator brochure, and of course, no signal detection had been performed. Ultimately, when the sponsor performed a retrospective review, it was seen that the signal had been present at the very beginning, and it wasn't being missed because people were ignoring the data. It was being missed because the data wasn't being looked at collectively. The safety is focused on individual cases rather than cumulative evidence. And I think this is an example where the investigators weren't failing, there was no failure of technology or of the drug, it was a failure of governance. The safety management plan had no predefined criteria for how cumulative liver enzyme trends would be reviewed. There was no routine aggregate safety review process in place, and they were missing documenting the process for how escalating patterns were going to emerge. And I think this lesson is a really important one. When we think of safety signals, it's rare that it's a dramatic event. It's unlikely I'm going to open my emails tomorrow and find that there's been 40, 50 grade 3 ALT elevations being reported. More often than not, they emerge gradually. It's one abnormality at a time. So the safety systems and governance that we have in place have to be strong enough to recognize those patterns long before our patients, before any harm comes to our patients. And that's why aggregate safety review doesn't begin in phase 3. It begins in phase 1. The next slide, please. So our second case study isn't going to focus on missing safety signals. It's about missing key safety documents. So again, this was an early stage biotech, and like many small sponsors, as we said, they outsourced their safety database management and reporting of serious adverse events to a CRO. And when you looked at the trial, everything was running smoothly. The study started, patients were dosed, adverse events were processed and added to the safety database on time. And within the regulatory timelines, and reporting timelines, serious adverse event or SUSARs were reported. So everything on the outside appeared to be going well. Now, before starting a phase 2A study, the sponsor done an internal audit, and that was where several issues were identified. So, although the work was being done, the framework to support that work wasn't there, and they had several findings. So there was no approved safety management plan in place, which meant that key responsibilities such as medical coding, reconciliation between our clinical and safety database, and sponsor oversight of the CRO were never formally assigned to anyone, or documented. And because these responsibilities weren't clearly defined, it meant that small inconsistencies accumulated. The result of that was that a significant number of serious adverse events had inconsistent meta coding, and there were several discrepancies between their clinical database and their safety database. Now, none of this was due to poor intent or any sort of lack of efficacy by the teams involved. It happened because everyone was relying on verbal agreements instead of having a documented process in place. And had regulators found these discrepancies during an inspection, the sponsor almost certainly would have had a major finding for inadequate sponsor oversight and weaknesses in their quality management system. And next slide. Now, fortunately, this was only a mock inspection. So the sponsor had the opportunity to correct the problems before the regulators began calling. And they were able to perform a full reconciliation of their safety and clinical databases. They could correct their coding errors, and they could put in place and approve a formal safety management plan where they had clearly documented responsibilities and oversight between the sponsor and the CRO could be documented. And I think this goes back again to what we were talking about earlier in our common pitfalls, where we said that we can outsource responsibility, but that accountability ultimately remains with you as the sponsor. You, as the sponsor, need to ensure that those safety frameworks and those processes are not only in place, but they're well documented long before we have our first patients dosed. I think, those early stage studies, there's a lot, there at times can be pressure, there's speed around them. But if we move too quickly and if we skip key steps, such as having that basic safety framework, we're putting our patients at risk. Next slide. So we've covered a lot here today, and what I've tried to do in the next couple of slides is just summarize a couple of key takeaway messages. So on the next slide then, so firstly, I think if you take nothing else away from today, take that the safety infrastructure that we have has to be established long before our first patient first visit. Now, I wish it was easy to say you need to do X, Y, and Z. Unfortunately, the safety infrastructure will vary and differ from one trial to the next. So it has to be proportionate for your product risk, but also the trial complexity. We can absolutely outsource our safety activities, but it is the sponsor that has that ultimate accountability. And what I hope the real world case study showed you is that it is vital that we have key safety documentation in place, such as our safety management plan, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities before our trials are active. And that once they are active from that very first patient, it's important that we're doing our aggregate trend analysis to detect signals before, one, they become regulatory findings, but more importantly, before they do any harm to our patients. The next slide. This slide here is just I guess, a checklist of things that we would absolutely 100% want to have in place before our first patient is ever dosed. And then final slide. So if I can leave with one message, regulations matter, reporting timelines matter, databases governance matter. They're all essential components, but they're not the purpose of drug safety. The purpose of drug safety is the people behind the data. Every safety report that we get relates to a real patient. Every signal we identify early prevents potential harm to a future patient. And every decision we make will ultimately contribute to a safer medication and to the ultimate success of your therapy. And that's the purpose of drug safety. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.